Hello, everyone. My name is Dimitri, and I'm here to tell you about light. Now, strange topic, I know, and also provocatively named. This talk is deliberately called LED versus incandescent, even though in the original version it was it was named differently. But we need the search hits, and we need people angry about having their incandescent lights taken away. So this is why the talk is called LED versus incandescent, although this talk is about everything in between, including the different light technologies that have come and gone in our lives. So what are we going to talk about here? So I'm going to talk about the history of key lighting inventions and sort of going through what humanity has gone through in terms of the different ways of generating artificial light. I'll talk about the key color metrics. Those are the measurements which kind of expose which light is good and which light is not so good. I'll give very simple explanations of light technology. So this isn't like a physics lecture or anything like that, not a technology lecture. I'll just describe in very simple terms how various tech works without going in depth, because that would take maybe several talks, and you can certainly find those online if you're interested. I will spend some time deliberately focusing on the health effects of light. That's a very important topic because ultimately, the reason why you care about light is not just being able to see things, but how through seeing stuff it actually affects you. And unfortunately, in some situations, it doesn't affect people positively. There's probably going to be a separate video for the technology demos. Now, originally, I was giving this talk live. And so I was doing the small technology demos in between the slides, but here that would have to go into a separate talk because I feel like this one is going to be too long. And finally, I wanted to mention that as you're watching this, please use speed controls to speed up the video if you need to. I will be talking rather slowly because this talk was originally given at an English speaking club, and for people who might not have come to that talk, I want to record things for them reasonably slowly. So if you need to speed things up, just use the controls, and that will make a lot of difference because I will not be speeding up for this particular talk. So let's begin. So for the vast majority of human history, for like 99%, the only light source that human beings operated under was the sun. That's the star that Earth orbits. And because of this, human physiology has evolved to depend primarily on the sun rising and setting. And that is something that is worth keeping in mind, even as we are now in the age where artificial light is cheap and readily available. Now, sunlight is pretty good. We know the benefits of sunlight. We also know the dangers of sunlight, like too much UV being bad for you, and that is why you use sun cream if you want to go sun tanning or lying at the beach. Personally, I've become less and less enthusiastic about getting a suntan after figuring out that it basically ages your skin. But anyway, sunlight is pretty good. On the one hand, you get heat and you get visibility, but it's also a very limiting source because after sunset, you have no light source whatsoever, except for maybe the moon, which of course is just the sun reflected off our satellite. But even then, even when you do have the moon, the visibility actually depends on the phase of the moon, and it also depends on cloud cover. So it's a bit of a hit and miss. In other words, you can assume that the night is generally dark. And that is unfortunately a problem, especially a problem for prehistoric humans because of predators. So the downside of darkness after sunset is that humans, they kind of turned from hunters to prey. And there are plenty of wild animals which have much better night seeing, which they see much better in the dark. Even your domestic cat sees much better in the dark. And what this means is that this becomes a problem for survival. And not just from large predators, obviously, but even smaller ones, like let's say you have spiders or ticks. if you cannot see them and they're sort of crawling on your body, then just finding them is a bit of a challenge, shall we say. So they can sneak up on you and they can bite you, and not much you can do about it. So we needed some sort of solution to this problem of seeing in the dark. And of course, the solution was fire. So I think we can honestly say this was a critical turning point in human evolution, the invention of fire, or the discovery of fire, because we didn't actually invent anything. We invented ways of starting fire, but fire by itself, you could get it from like a lightning strike or something. And we don't know exactly how long ago fire was invented. Current estimates, they place it to, let's say, about 500,000 years to maybe 1,000,000 years. But fire is a kind of universal medium, and it provides 3 distinct advantages. So first of all, you can keep warm, which is kind of critical for humans, especially humans who would want to migrate from the warmer kind of equatorial areas of the planet to the colder ones. Because without fire, you couldn't move to a place like England, for example. You would just freeze to death. So the second benefit is cooking. I don't know if prehistoric humans actually enjoyed eating raw meat, but as modern humans, I'm sure you'll agree that cooked meat is much more appealing. And finally, and crucially to our discussion, fire has allowed people to see in the dark. Now, with fire, you suddenly have a defense against all those scary things out there in the night. So you can sleep in peace, while perhaps one of your tribe stands watch and there is a fire burning, and you'd be alert and ready to react if something came at you for some reason. So what you could do is you can set up your home in some cave or other. You can sit by the fire. You can tell stories. You can cook some meat of a freshly slaughtered, I don't know, mammoth or saber-toothed tiger or something like that. And then you would go to sleep, and the fire would still be burning. So nobody could sort of sneak up on you, because you would just wake up and ready to react, ready to see what the danger actually is. You also notice that there is a young man there holding a stick. Now, what you can do is you can put that stick into the fire, and then you can venture out into the darkness to hunt, or just to go from point A to point B. That is, of course, the torch. So you can just set a stick on fire, but you can also take that stick and wrap it in cloth that's drenched with some animal oil. Well, that came a bit later, but that is, your typical torch that would allow you to go around and maybe set the jungle on fire too. So fire is obviously dangerous, it's destructive, and the torch is something you could take to like a village your enemies with, and do some damage if you wanted to. So that is the sort of primitive technology that has existed for a long time. Now, of course, the thing is, sooner or later, people have discovered certain liquids that are actually burning, like animal fat or some oil seed oil, for example, so seed oil. And we came about with all sorts of oil lamps. Now, of course, the oil lamp here in the picture is a bit too advanced, so it's a more sophisticated clay-formed kind of lamp, but there were simpler oil lamps, basically just stone or shell containers filled with animal fat or plant oil, and you had some sort of wick-like material, so moss or fibers that would stick. You would stick it into the oil, and then oil would burn off the surface. These are associated with early modern humans and possibly Neanderthals. So the approximate, earliest oil lamps are placed at around 70,000 BC. So you can see the time scales here. If we're talking 500,000 years for fire, then only 70,000 years for an oil lamp. Now, coming back to the idea of a campfire, you could, of course, with the introduction of proper building and proper homes, you would move that into a fireplace, and that is where you would once again have a bunch of logs burning. You would have a chimney so that all the harmful gases would go out the top of the building, and this also provided both heat and light, and also possibilities for cooking. Now, of course, as a source of light, the fireplace isn't ideal, because it's a single location of light, and you want light to be more distributed, shall we say, and also more portable, which it brought about the idea of candles and candlelight. Now, originally, candles were available to rich people. That's how it got started, but eventually it became a normal occurrence. Nowadays, candles are still used and sold because they provide a certain coziness and warmth and ambience to whatever dwelling, and cafes and restaurants use them liberally. This shown up at 3000 BC. So notice how the time scales are compressing. So it would take a huge amount of time between fire and oil lamps, a smaller time gap between oil lamps and candlelight, and these gaps, they would keep on decreasing all the time as we invent different things to burn. And the next thing that we decided we wanted to burn was gas. So gas lighting is the first modern, or the first system that is considered to be a modern light system, and a light distribution system as well. It was used in the 18th and 19th centuries, and the idea is that you would take coal gas, and later we used natural gas for this purpose, but originally you would take coal gas, you would pump it into buildings and into streets, and inside the actual unit, you would have a small nozzle which releases the gas and burns it. And this kind of thing is certainly much brighter than a candle. And it's also it's a systematic approach. So it's a first large-scale approach to how to get lots of streets and buildings and people's dwellings supplied with a kind of a good source of light. It's still related to burning something and using a flame as the source of the actual light. And in that same vein, we also have the good old kerosene lamp. So this was invented in the 1850s. It was the main lighting tech before everything went electric. Now, kerosene is a result of refining petroleum. It's somewhere in between the typical petrol and diesel fuels that you use in your car. Now, kerosene is still used today, so a highly refined form of kerosene is used in jet fuel. And you can also buy kerosene nowadays in any hardware store. It's primarily being sold for cleaning, but at the same time, you can also burn it inside a kerosene lamp, and there's plenty of lamps available to buy if you're interested in this sort of thing. It's great for kind of outdoorsy places, although of course, if you're going outdoors, then battery powered LEDs are going to be much more efficient, but this has that feel of more natural, shall we say, light. And I would recommend getting a kerosene lamp. They just look like works of art. It's not just about the flame, it's about the object being really good looking. And the ones that are sold nowadays are really great looking. But anyways, the idea of burning something and setting something on fire came to an end because of the discovery of electricity, and brought about the idea of incandescent light. So this guy is Thomas Edison. He's not the inventor of electricity, but he did invent the kind of ecosystem for using electricity, although direct current, not the alternating current that we use nowadays, for all sorts of things, including, of course, light. And that's a system that has been around since the late 1800s up until today, effectively, because we still use incandescent bulbs in many locations where other forms of bulbs are simply impossible to use. And of course, some of the more daring people actually use it as the main source of light. So the principle is very simple. You have electricity which goes through some very thin wire, like some very thin tungsten filament, and it meets resistance as it tries to go through that thin wire. So it causes that thin filament to glow, and that is where you get that nice warm amber color that everybody is used to. And so we get what is probably the pinnacle of light engineering, and that is the incandescent light bulb, the thing that kind of changed it all, so to speak. So it's a very simple construct, actually. It's just a glass dome. There is a tungsten filament inside it, so that little thin wire that glows. It also has a screw connection at the bottom, and in Europe we have two main formats for these. We have the E27, which is the larger connection, and E14, which is the slightly smaller connection. The letter E there is the Edison screw base. Now, of course, in other countries there are other connections, like the UK, the US, many other countries, they try to use different things. There's now lots and lots of different types of bulbs that you can get with different connections, but these are the principal ones in Europe. And this is the bulb that will give you that yellow or amber tinted color. Now, these bulbs, by design, only work for about 1,000 hours. There's a separate story as to how that number was derived and how we got to this number. Basically, it's a kind of, on the one hand, it's a kind of conspiracy. On the other hand, it's a kind of standardization, if you will, getting everything to one standard. 1,000 hours really isn't a lot. Like if you run it at 12 hours a day, which, if you're, for example, if it's winter and you don't get any sun at all, you're going to be running it all the time. So in 3 months, this bulb is going to die and you'll have to buy another one. And changing bulbs is annoying for lots of reasons. Well, one reason is your ceilings might be just too high and inaccessible, but also, you might have 200 bulbs in your house, and if one fails every 3 months, then this means you will be changing one bulb a day, which is just infuriating. So I guess that's one of the reasons why people got fed up with them. But the main problem with the incandescent bulb is that it's energy inefficient. So essentially, it's not so much a light emitter as it is a heat emitter. 90% of the energy that you spend on the bulb actually goes to heating, goes to thermal emissions, and only 10% actually produces light. Another annoyance of this clear glass bulb is that it's a point source of light. So without some sort of diffusion, it's a really harsh light. It produces harsh shadows. It's very uncomfortable to look at with your eyes because the light from this point source goes directly into your eyes as a single point, as a kind of concentrated beam, so to speak. So it's not the greatest technology, but it was certainly a turning point because all of a sudden people realized that, you don't need to burn something and worry about burning off the oxygen in your home. You can instead just use the electricity and have this thing hanging and providing illumination. So now that we've mentioned it, it's a good time to talk about some of the light related terms. I promise to go light here because I don't want to get too much in depth in terms of the metrics, but we're going to talk about three things. We're going to talk about color temperature, color spectrum, and the color rendering index. So let's first of all talk about color temperature. So the idea is that if you take, like, let's say a piece of metal or some theoretical black body which doesn't consume light by itself, doesn't reflect anything, and you heat it up, then the temperature which is going to glow is going to affect the color. So if you just heat it up a little bit, it's going to glow red. If you heat it up a lot more, it's going to be yellow, and then it's going to be kind of whitish, and then it will turn blue. So that is the sort of color spectrum of incandescent light as we heat up the filament inside the bulb. However, most of incandescent light is actually one uniform color temperature, and it's kind of amber. So it's not quite red, it's more amber-ish. Unfortunately, we cannot really heat up light bulbs significantly more because then the filament would fail. So it would be great if we could have incandescent light bulbs that provided pure white light, kind of like daylight, but we cannot. Still, we use this scale quite a bit when we talk about LEDs and other light sources because they all have some sort of color temperature. But the thing is, LEDs and gas discharge lamps and so on, they don't have a piece of metal that is being heated up. So instead of color temperature, we talk about correlated color temperature. And the idea is that if this light was a black body radiator, what temperature would give a similar color? So we look for similarity between what an LED, for example, outputs and what an incandescent or black body radiator would produce at this color temperature. So let's talk about the typical color temperatures that you will find nowadays in the real world. So at the lower, the more red scale of the whole thing, we have basically the color of sunset, also the color of fire. So 1800 to 2200K. If in terms of light bulbs, these are actually pretty rare, and you can get them. You can get decorative sort of night lights, and cafes and restaurants sometimes hang these kinds of bulbs because they provide a certain relaxing mood, relaxing space, shall we say. So but in a typical shop, if you go into a hardware store, you're unlikely to see 2200K LED bulbs, for example, because the demand for them simply isn't as high. What's more common and probably the most popular variety is around 2700K or 3000K. For many people, including a large number of designers, light designers or interior designers, 2700K is kind of the default. It's also the default for a lot of the more relaxing public spaces like cafes, restaurants, and so on and so forth, because it's part of the reason is certainly historic, that because incandescent light is this color temperature, everybody kind of gravitates to this value. So that is the default for living spaces, I guess. But obviously, that's not the only option that you can go for. There are 4000K lights. Obviously, those would be LEDs primarily. That is the neutral white color. And this is often used in working environments. So when you're in a working setting, it's great to get people to be more alert. And to get them to be more alert, you introduce a bit more blue color into the mix. And so we get this 4000K neutral white. Some people, by the way, they prefer 4000K in their homes as well, and that is also fine. I personally think that is too cold of a color, but then again, people have different preferences, and it turns out that people who live in warmer countries, they prefer colder colors, and the people who live in colder countries, they prefer the warmer colors, maybe because they're missing all that sunlight. So anyway, in addition to this, you also get color temperatures of around 5000 to 6000, which corresponds to daylight. That is neutral light. Now, we don't particularly have it or like it in normal interior spaces, but there are cases where it's absolutely critical. So if you're doing printing or working with like prints or art or something, you want to present the art in the most correct way. And so for that purpose, you want something which is a very balanced light without any cast. You don't want it to be blue and you don't want it to be amber either. Now, I'm saying this only in theoretical terms, because in practical terms, if you go to a museum, like go ahead, just go to your nearest museum and look what kind of light sources they use. They do not actually use these neutral light sources. They typically go on the level of 4000K or thereabouts. Why? Well, because if you were to use 5000K on the light, the artworks, then you would also have to use 5000K on everything else, and it would create a very uncomfortable or less comfortable, shall we say, a very non-meditative kind of environment, which is what you want in a museum. You want people to relax and to walk about and to enjoy the paintings, to maybe sit down. If you put in 5,000K or 6,000K, I think they will be more alert, they will be more annoyed by the surroundings, and you don't really want that. There is a solution to all of this, and the solution is to use framing lights, that is, light sources which have those little shutters, so they only shine on paintings and not on walls, and the rest of the museum is basically kept dark. There are museums, like I was in a museum in Milan, I think, or maybe it was Florence, one of those places where they used that, and it was an absolutely striking look, because you're walking around in sort of semi-darkness, but they're using accurate light on the paintings and the art objects themselves. But generally, museums don't do that either, partly because, well, those framing lights, they're expensive. I have some at home, and they're, well, in my case, they're about $200 each, but I'm sure they charge more for museums. So finally, I wanted to mention that, yes, you can buy light sources which have a colder color temperature, sort of corresponding to an overcast day, but that is a very niche approach. I don't know who would want to have so much blue content in their dwelling. I'm sure there are some industrial uses for it, but that is also something that is difficult to find in a typical hardware store. Now, the key number you need to remember is the color temperature of incandescent light, which is 2700K. Why should you remember that? Well, one of the reasons is that if you want to mix different light sources, let's say you want to mix incandescent and LEDs in your home, then they all better be 2700K or maybe 3000K, but certainly not deviate from that. It is really terrible when people try to mix different color temperatures in a single room. I've never seen it work well, and I do not recommend that anybody actually does it. So that is our talk about color temperature. So color temperature is how a hypothetical black body that's heated up would correspond in terms of the color that it emits. But generally, we have lots more color. We have the electromagnetic spectrum, which has all sorts of stuff from cosmic rays to radio. And somewhere in between this spectrum, we have the visible light. So that's the light that human beings can't see. Generally, it's different for other animals, and some people have sensitivity to, say, more outside this band. But generally, we have this visible light spectrum. So it goes violet, then blue, then cyan, then green, yellow, and red. To the left of violet, we have ultraviolet, which, as you know, is well, you need ultraviolet in some degree, but if you have too much of it, that's a problem, because, well, we know that it can cause cancer and other unpleasant things. On the right side, we have the infrared radiation, which is, of course, heat. And yeah, you also need heat, but too much heat is also not great. And also, wasting power on heat is not the best way to go for light bulbs. Well, it might be if it's winter and you're simply reusing all that heat, but generally it's just wasted energy, basically. So the thing that we care about is the color spectrum. The color spectrum is basically how the energy produced by an emitter is distributed across the different wavelengths. So let's take a look at some examples. On the left, you see the sun at noon. So that is what we call the color white, but of course there is no white. White is simply a combination of all the different wavelengths of visible light. So you can see that it's more or less uniform. Yeah, there's slightly less blue and violet, but generally all the components are there and they are more or less uniform, and that is the sun at noon. Now, in the evening, the kind of sunset color, you lose out on the blues and the violets, and the greens are subdued, but the reds are obviously still going strong. So that's why the sunset is typically kind of yellow, amber, pink. It depends actually on where you live. It depends on the time of year, what the sunset looks like, but it's generally skewed towards the redder part of the spectrum. And of course, at night, you have only artificial light. You might have a flare flame, or you might have an incandescent light. And in both of those cases, this is what the color spectrum looks like. So you have hardly any blues or violets, you have a little bit of green, but mainly you have lots and lots of reds, and that is why we have that amber light produced by both flames as well as incandescent light sources, and also why the slides on my presentation are kind of orange reddish, because I want to color match the discussion point here. And the final piece of the puzzle that I want to talk about is the color rendering index. So this is the idea of somehow measuring the quality of the colors as they are reflected when being shined at with a particular light source. So essentially, it's a standardized set of reference colors. You take your light source, you shine at those colors, and then you measure how well they transmit those colors. Now, there are lots of problems with CRI as an index of quality. But essentially, it's an attempt to get some sort of number from 0 to 100, representing how well a light source actually works. Now, one of the problems is that when we look at marketing numbers, and manufacturers, they typically say, oh, we have a CRI of more than 90. These marketing numbers, they only use the color samples from the top row and not the bottom row. So typically for most or all manufacturers, actually, they calculate CRI on the basis of those the top row of washed out colors, and they completely ignore the other colors from R9 to R14. And critically, they ignore R9. And R9 is a more saturated red color. And that is very important because red is the skin of other people. It is the food on our plate often. So if you ignore red, well, that's not a good thing. That's why when we talk about light sources, we don't typically just talk about the CRI. We also talk about R9, and we might talk about other things, other more complicated measurements as well. But CRI is still for us some kind of indicator. It's not the best indicator, but it is for us an indicator of how well a particular light emitter actually lights up the world. Because in some bulbs, the CRI can actually be quite poor. So the typical values are as follows. First of all, you have bulbs which advertise more than 80 CRI. I would generally avoid these bulbs, but there is a bit of a problem here because the ultra efficient LEDs, the LEDs which provide maximum efficiency, at the moment, they can only manage more than 80 CRI, so they cannot go even above the 90 barrier. So if you want a light bulb which in the European Union has an energy rating of like A, then it's most likely going to have more than 90 on its CRI color rating. Now, more than 90 is pretty good. So you are getting some reasonable light source there. More than 95 is excellent. And you can certainly reach higher values, but those become very specialized LEDs, very complicated kind of bulbs or expensive bulbs to get. And of course, another way to get good CRI is to simply go for incandescent lights, which have a CRI of 100, or some people put 99, some people put 100. The point is, incandescent lights, when an incandescent light falls onto an object, the color that gets transmitted, it gets transmitted with full fidelity. Now, of course, you do have an amber tint. So a tint is something that is not included in this measurement, but at least when your eyes see reality under incandescent light, they see a complete picture, whereas where you use LEDs, especially cheap LEDs, your eyes, they see a less complete picture because some of the colors might not be transmitted as well as others. So let's talk a little bit about the different variations in incandescent bulbs. So first of all, there is variety in terms of power, and as a result, the amount of light that a bulb might be emitting. So for a simple kind of night lamp, you might have a 25-watt bulb, whereas to light up a room, you would need maybe 95 watts or more. The reason why 95 is here is because, at least in the country where I live, you're not actually allowed to sell light bulbs of 100 watts or more as light bulbs. Instead, they do sell them, and they also sell 200-watt bulbs and 300-watt bulbs, but they are typically sold as heat emitters, and they are supposedly sold in a kind of industrial use. But of course, people are welcome to use them just in ordinary kind of settings. So there is some legislation there, but it has been very limited, and ordinary incandescents up until 100 watts are still available in all sorts of shapes and sizes. And speaking of shapes, yeah, you do get bulbs in different shapes. So the most common shape is, of course, the pear, but there are also candle-shaped ones and mushroom-shaped ones, and really there are just lots of variations. Also, in terms of coating, so the most popular incandescents are, of course, clear, but there are also frosted bulbs. Now, notice frosted is not the same as like matte. Frosted basically means that you sandblast the bulb a little bit, so it becomes kind of it doesn't become completely opaque, but it becomes semi-transparent. So the light doesn't become as harsh, but on the other hand, you don't lose too much energy. You maybe lose about 10% of the emitted light, but it becomes smoother, but it's still difficult to look at with your eyes, though it's more possible this way. Now, in terms of how the bulbs are structured, most of them are still a point source, meaning you have a point of filament, it glows, it emits light in all directions, that's it. But there are variations. So, for example, we have reflector bulbs, which try to sort of point only in one direction and have a bulb in the other direction. And we have mirrored bulbs, which have a mirror on the front, and it's like a bulb that shoots back into itself. I would have to do a separate video on showing how all of these actually look, because, well, it's an interesting discussion. In terms of connecting them and powering them, most incandescent bulbs use the typical mains electricity, so 230 volts in Europe and 120 or 110 in the States. But you also get incandescent light sources in cars, and those would use 12 volts typically. And there are special incandescent bulbs for ships, which use 12 or 24 or 36 volts. And they are somewhat specialty, but you can still buy them. Like, you can go on AliExpress and just buy a 24-volt incandescent if you want. There are benefits to doing this, but it's more of an advanced kind of topic. One thing I wanted to discuss with relation to use of incandescent light sources is the idea of dimming. So basically, dimming is just giving a bulb less electricity, not giving it the full electric sine wave, but actually cutting off bits on the front or the back. As a result, and you use a dimmer for this, as a result, the filament in the bulb becomes a bit colder. And remember, when things get colder, the color temperature decreases, so the glow becomes even more red or even more orange. And that is often called a dim to warm effect in bulbs. And that is another reason why incandescent bulbs are so great, because they are already pretty warm in terms of the light they produce. But if you dim it, it becomes warmer still. It gets closer to that feeling of campfire or sunlight or peace, relaxation, that sort of thing. So in a kind of evolutionary sense, it basically provides an additional measure of comfort, if you will. There are downsides to this as well. Like, when you dim bulbs, their efficiency drops even more. Remember, they were inefficient already, but they become even more inefficient. On the other hand, the lifetime of these bulbs is greatly improved. This idea of dimming and generally just providing less electricity to the bulb created another sector of incandescent bulbs, which exists to this very day. That is one of the kind of legitimate uses of incandescence. And that is, of course, the decorative incandescent bulbs, also sometimes called Edison-style incandescent bulbs. So these are the same as ordinary incandescent bulbs from the perspective of physics, but they are powered differently. They typically have longer filaments, and so they produce an even warmer color, typically at around 2200 K, so it's more red than even ordinary incandescents. They typically have nice filament designs, which means you can hang them without any shade or any diffusion, and they just look good. And hotels and restaurants use them quite a bit for this particular purpose. There are lots of shapes and sizes of these bulbs. Like there's huge variation. You get obviously the pear-shaped ones, the kind of antique-shaped ones. You get tubes and so on and so forth. It's really quite a variety. The bulbs have really low efficiency. They are up to 3 times worse than ordinary incandescent bulbs, but they do have longer lives. They can last for 5,000 hours because they don't run so hot. And they're also dimmable because essentially they operate on the same physical processes and principles as ordinary incandescent bulbs. They are just slight variation, but still it's the idea of filament meeting resistance, electricity meeting resistance in the filament rather, and the filament glowing. So the use cases for these bulbs are restaurants, and cafes and similar places that want to create a certain coziness. In the home, you would use them for bedroom lights, for example, for places where you're about to go to sleep and you want something to shine in a similar way to a sunset. Once again, there's a big tie into, I think, evolutionary kind of responses that people have, because for the prehistoric humans, they would see the sunset or they would see fire as the end of the day, the end of the working day, the end of the struggle, a time to relax, to recharge, to renew. And so exploiting this effect in modern times, I think, is very relevant and very good. Now, of course, we can talk about low efficiency here, but in institutions, for example, like cafes or large hotels, they don't care. For them, the electricity cost of hanging 100 of these somewhere is irrelevant compared to their operating budgets and conditions. In the home, a bulb like this, like the ones shown here, would typically consume 40 to 60 watts, and they are nice. They feel really good. So it's up to you whether you want to spend this much energy, spend this much electricity on something that simply looks good. So that is, if you will, the second variation of the incandescent technology. Now we need to talk about the third variation of incandescence, which are halogen bulbs. And they were used from the 1950s, and they're still used today in some situations. The halogens are essentially a form of, if you will, upgraded incandescence. So they do have improved efficiency. Nominally, it's 20 to 30%. I think marketing now tries to stretch it up to 50%. So they say that a 42-watt halogen is the same as a 60-watt incandescent, which I'm not sure is really the case. They do have a slightly improved lifespan. They do run a little hotter, so they're marginally whiter. So instead of being 2700 K, they reach around 3000 K. So maybe it's slightly better for work. Maybe it's less relaxing and more kind of in focus. They're also dimmable because the physical processes are very similar. You still have a filament, but the operation is slightly different because the tungsten molecules that get burnt off the filament through the halogen cycle inside the capsule, they get redeposited back. And that is what makes the bulb last longer and be slightly more efficient. On the other hand, there are other issues with this bulb that you need to be aware of, like it is dimmable, no doubt about it. But you do need the bulb to run at full power at least sometimes. Why? Because you need this halogen cycle to work. If you keep the bulb dimmed at all times, then it will eventually turn black and fail. So that's something to watch out for. With incandescents, ordinary ones, you can keep the bulb dimmed indefinitely and everything will be fine. More than fine, in actual fact, it will last much longer. So let's take a look at a comparison of the different incandescent emitters. So here, the things I list are color temperature, lifetime or expected lifetime in the number of hours. I also list efficiency. So efficiency is typically measured in terms of lumens per watt. Now you can think of lumens as amount of light emitted. So a measure of the amount of light that's being emitted per a single watt of electricity being used. So with incandescence, it's about 15. With halogen, well, 25-ish, depends. With decorative incandescence, it's only about 5. So you can see it's a lot less efficient than anything out there. But you do get the benefits of it looking good, basically. Now, in terms of use cases, incandescents are used, they're used in the home. They are also sometimes used on ships, although nowadays boats and everything, they are going in the direction of LEDs, obviously, because, well, the benefits are overwhelming. If you're powering a light through a generator on the ship, you don't want any large energy consumption. So halogen is used in general in the workplace. It's also used in automotive, in lights, in car lights. So some cars still use halogen. And I must confess, even though halogen lights in a car are much weaker, they're also much nicer and a lot less annoying, to be honest. And decorative incandescents are used for decoration and, cafes, restaurants, hotels, that sort of thing. In the home, you would use it in the spaces where you want to relax, basically. In terms of casings, so incandescents can be clear or frosted. Halogen bulbs, they can be clear or frosted. They're also, you can buy these really powerful halogen bulbs, like 150 watt bulbs, 250 watt bulbs. They typically have these quartz high intensity casings, which just they look like frosted or matte or something like that, just thicker glass generally, because a lot of heat is being generated. And decorative incandescent bulbs, they use clear glass because you do want to look at the filament. The filament is arranged in a nice shape, and you want everybody to be able to see that. Now, in terms of formats, and here I'm focusing on Europe, incandescent bulbs are typically E27 and E14. Halogen, on the other hand, is not just those, but also a lot of other formats, because it just turns out that with halogen, because the capsule is so small, people started fitting this capsule into all sorts of smaller light fixtures, like ceiling light fixtures and tiny emitters and so on and so forth. And as a result, we have a huge variety of different connection types and different bulbs and luminaires using halogen. And of course, decorative incandescents are typically E27. In terms of power, incandescents and decorative incandescents use mains power. Incandescent lights also exist in low voltage varieties for ships and those sorts of situations. Whereas with halogen, there is a separate reality, if you will, a whole branch of our reality, and that is 12-volt halogen, which probably could benefit from a talk of its own, why it came to be and why is it like a separate reality, but it exists. If you go to a hardware store, there's likely to be a specific shelf in the bulb section for 12-volt bulbs specifically. It's not automotive. It's in-home bulbs that use 12 volts. Well, the main reason why it came to be is because 12 volts is kind of touch safe. So if you want electricity in your bathroom, for example, it's much better to have low voltage than high voltage. But like I said, it's a separate discussion. 12-volt halogen does exist, and it's a viable solution if you have a place to put the transformer. And the transformers, by the way, the 12-volt transformers, they are special. They are not like the typical AC-DC transformers. It's still AC. It's 12-volt alternating current. Fascinating separate discussion. But we now need to move on. And I want to move away, at least for a while, from the in-home light sources to the more industrial and outdoor light sources. And because of that, we need to discuss a particular physics phenomenon called an arc, an electric arc. So essentially the idea is as follows. Like if you want to consume electricity provided by some source like a battery or mains power, then you would have a loop. So you would have your phase going into the device and the neutral going out. And those are typically connected. So you have a loop of wire going through something, through resistance, maybe through a light bulb. But if you take the connections and you pull them apart a little bit, then what can happen is you could get something called an electric arc. The idea is that the air ionizes and electricity actually tries to jump through this air, which is dangerous, actually. Arc faults are dangerous. They can set things on fire, and we generally want to avoid them any way we can, which is why we have special arc fault protection devices. And whenever there is electric wire running through wooden structures, we try to put it in metal conduit of some kind. So all of this is not great, but it also allows us to have a benefit from it all. And that benefit is light sources called high intensity discharge light sources. And they actually operate on this idea of an electric arc that goes through some sort of gas or some medium that it subsequently lights up. So the idea is that you use high voltage to create an arc between electrodes. And when I say high voltage, I don't mean like mains voltage, like 230 AC. I mean more like 5 kilovolts worth of voltage. So 5,000 volts going to create an arc. Now, what this arc does is it excites gas, and it might be a gas with certain metal vapors there. And as a result, you have an intense emission of light. And there are lots and lots of different varieties of high-intensity discharge sources that operate on this principle. So metal halide, sodium, mercury, and so on and so forth. We'll talk about some of them, and most of them are a sort of historical footnote, but many of them are still being used, and many of them are still available. So the first one is mercury vapor. That kind of greenish light. That was used in the sort of 1900 to 1930s, so a while back. This has a green tint, and mercury vapor it contains mercury. And mercury, as you probably know, is toxic, which means that, if it leaks, you're in danger. You have to it's like the thermometers, we have these thermometers which contain mercury inside them. If you break one of them, you have to quickly hoover up all the mercury. Luckily for us, it turns liquid at room temperature, so you can see the little balls of mercury. But their actual fumes are toxic, so you want to get rid of them as soon as possible. Also, these bulbs, if the bulb actually breaks, there is UV exposure. So additional ultraviolet emissions that you probably do not need. Curiously enough, you can still buy these bulbs. Not sure why you would do them, because a green cast is just unpleasant in all sorts of ways. But then again, throughout history, people haven't really been too concerned about coloring reality a particular way. So, for example, low pressure sodium is something that comes to mind. This was used from the 50s until the 80s. Some countries really went all in on low pressure sodium specifically, and you'll see why in a moment. But low pressure sodium is essentially monochromatic. It's like turning the world black and white, except it's not black and white, it's black and orange. So you don't get any color perception. Like if a street light, for example, is blue, you don't see it as blue. Everything just becomes one color, because essentially you have just this one spike created by sodium excitation at a particular wavelength. That's it. So it's absolutely just totally orange light. Now, the reason people use it is because low pressure sodium is extremely energy efficient. It's energy efficient at the level of current, even the best LEDs that you can get today. So that explains why everybody was like, hey, finally we get to save lots and lots of energy because we just get lots of light as a result. And it was used in all sorts of places like highways, tunnels, ports, industrial areas. But of course, sooner or later, people realize that the light quality, just having one single light, one single color is just crazy, because then like your grass isn't green anymore. It was eventually phased out due to specifically the poor color rendering. But what came after low pressure sodium is high pressure sodium. So it's something of an improvement on this technology. So this was used from the 1960s, and it's still used today, surprisingly enough. Like, I know at least one city block, a very expensive kind of gated community, where the streetlights are still high pressure sodium because they can afford it, basically. So it was used in street illumination and also for industrial use, like warehouses and whatever. It's also very efficient, not as efficient as low pressure sodium, but we're still talking values which rival LEDs, so that's fine. It's still pretty good. Now, the lifespan of this kind of bulb is really high, like 3 to 6 years. So compared to like an incandescent bulb, just completely different, like orders of magnitude improvement. So very tempting. And this bulb produces warm orange light. The correlated color temperature is around 2000 K, but the color quality is still not great. So it's better than low pressure sodium. If you look at the spectral diagram here, you can see that it's not just a single amber spike. There's some yellow and some orange and some red and even some green or cyan there marginally. But still not great, because, well, somewhat better, but your grass isn't going to be green. Still, with all that said, I would say that high pressure sodium is still viable for use in streetlights, because ultimately the amount of color information that high pressure sodium gives you, and if you use it outdoors around your home, the amount of color information is good enough. It's especially good enough if those are transient places where you don't stick around for a long time, or you don't try to read a book under high pressure sodium. You walk under it, you drive under it, that sort of thing. Still, this entire technology, the idea of like an arc through gas of some kind, continued improving. And the next step was metal halide. So metal halide was used from the 60s until today, and unlike the sodium varieties, it actually gave colder, kind of more daylight-like colors. In actual fact, when you buy a metal halide bulb today, you can choose the color temperature. So you can get metal halide with sort of more sunsetish or incandescent-like color temperature, 3000, or you can get something colder, like a 6000 K color temperature. This has an even better spectrum than high-pressure sodium. Obviously not as good and not as smooth as incandescent light, because you can still see there are spikes which correlate to the wavelengths where a particular component of the metal halide gas mixture is excited. Metal halide bulbs, by the way, they're also energy efficient. Now, these bulbs, they weren't just used for street illumination, they were used for sports, for example. So if you're playing like a game, like football or something, you don't really want all your players and everything to be colored orange, because that would just be extremely weird and unpleasant. And you want lots of light, like huge amounts of light. And at the same time, you do want efficiency, but you don't want everything to be colored. So this is why this kind of spectrum was used in sports and stadiums, in architectural lighting. Like recently I went to a museum, and the architectural lights around the building were metal halide. So yeah, it was used in many places. One particular point with metal halide is it does output UV as well. So that means that you have to have some sort of an enclosure which filters out UV as you kind of use this light. And metal halide bulbs are still available, and the technology for firing up metal halide and high pressure sodium is pretty much the same. And speaking of technology, there's something that we need to mention, because it's not just a bulb that you're getting. So yeah, you do need a bulb, obviously, of a specific variety. But in addition, remember I said that the arc that is required to fire up or strike the bulb needs really high voltage. and your mains voltage is too low. So you need some sort of an igniter. So you need a separate box which actually sort of raises this voltage and then fires it through the bulb to get the process started. But there is a second problem to this. So you see, with incandescent bulbs, what happens is the resistance is initially low when the bulb is cold. So as you turn on an incandescent bulb, there is a massive inrush of current. There is massive stress on the incandescent bulb, which is why with dimmers, incandescent bulbs live a lot longer. But as an incandescent bulb lights up, the resistance actually increases, and so the bulb kind of self-stabilizes, which means its energy consumption doesn't run away to infinity. Now, the problem with these high-intensity light sources is their resistance as they are activated actually decreases, which means that in theory, without some control, a high-intensity light bulb would just consume more and more and more power until it explodes. So there is a third component that you need, and that third component is the ballast. So the ballast actually controls that the bulb doesn't try to consume infinite amounts of energy and doesn't explode. So you put all of these three things together, and you have yourself a system that can, where the igniter can strike up the bulb, and then the ballast controls that the bulb doesn't actually consume too much energy. That means that the ballast, the power rating of the ballast has to match the bulb exactly. So if you have a 70-watt bulb, you need a 70-watt ballast. There are electronic ballasts, though, where you can control the actual amount of energy that is being consumed. But generally, we use dumb ballasts, like very simple ballasts, which have a fixed power rating. Another thing in this context that I wanted to mention is the hot restrike delay. And this applies specifically to high pressure bulbs as opposed to low pressure ones, because remember we talked about low pressure sodium, but this is related to high pressure bulbs like HPS or metal halide. Essentially, they have this weird downside that you can't switch them on immediately after switching them off. And you certainly cannot flicker the switch up and down with these kinds of bulbs, unlike incandescents. And the reason is that you have high pressure inside the bulb. And when that high pressure is reached, then the voltage needed to light it up again is even higher than initially. So if you needed 5,000 volts initially, then for a second time at high pressure, it's not enough. So your igniter is insufficient for this purpose. So what can we do about this? Well, for non-critical use, you simply wait. So you wait like 10 minutes or something, and then you try again. And then in actual fact, on every package of this bulb, it tells you that its lifespan and it's kind of you'll basically break it if you switch it on and off all the time. But there are situations where you need very quick restrike capability. Like, for example, if you're in a tunnel and power fails, a generator kicks in, but the generator doesn't take 10 minutes. It might take 1 minute or less to kick in, and you need that power on as soon as possible, which is why we have this variation. So we have bulbs with 2 capsules instead of 1. And this allows you to immediately restart the power after, let's say, a power cut. And it also provides a kind of redundancy because, well, if one of the capsules fails, the other one lives, and it does extend the lifetime of the actual bulb. So a very simple design, but remember you can only restrike once, meaning that you have a power failure, you turn on again. But if there is another power failure, then both of the capsules are at high pressure and you cannot do it a third time. And one really annoying thing about all of these is that home automation systems, they know nothing about these bulbs. If you want correct operation of a 2-capsule bulb like this, you basically have to program it yourself, because by default, no component that you buy lets you specify that you have this 2-capsule bulb, or a single capsule bulb for that matter. So they simply don't know about restrikes. That's just one of those things to watch out for. So let's take a look at a comparison of the different high intensity emitters. These are not all the high intensity emitters out there. There are more variations, but these are the sort of common ones. So you'll see, let's ignore the color temperature, because correlated color temperature is only part of the story. The fact is, some of these bulbs have just an awful spectrum. Their lifetime is reasonable, which means you can use them for a long time. But even though the lifetime is reasonable, people still are updating highway and street lampposts from these bulbs to LEDs, even though their efficiency is high. Why? Because actually changing them is not just about changing the bulb. It's also the starter that can go wrong, or it's the ballast that can go wrong. So you want to minimize like the overall system efficiency, shall we say. In terms of efficiency, by the way, as you can see, low pressure sodium is like LED level levels, basically. High pressure sodium is not far behind. Metal halide is also pretty good. So all of them are. So you cannot say that, oh, LEDs are more efficient. They're not at the moment, not in any significant way. In terms of formats, you can get most of these in E27. That metal halide should also be E27, not E24. You can get most of them in E27. There's also an E40 format, which is a slightly larger kind of industrial format for larger bulbs, typically used in larger enclosures. And there are specialized formats throughout. And they are mains powered. So the entire setup of igniter plus ballast plus bulb would use mains voltage. The CRI of those, once again, remember that CRI is about how well specific colors are rendered, not how well the entire spectrum is rendered. So for metal halide, the CRI might be high at 80, but that's still, metal halide bulbs, they still produce a look that's very recognizable. Like some colors are transmitted better and some colors are transmitted worse because of the spikes and the gaps in the overall color spectrum. So just having a high-ish CRI doesn't really help that much. But let's get back to reality. Let's get back to Earth and talk about another light that was used in the home and in public places. And that is, of course, fluorescent light. And most of you would remember it as tube lights. Those were used from the 1930s, and I'm sure you can still find them in some like municipal places where they didn't bother to change them. But generally, up until around 2000s, and also in the later decades, they came up with a compact fluorescent. So that is a light bulb, which is this swirly kind of tunnel, which could strike itself without any additional equipment. You just screw it in instead of the ordinary ones. Now, the reason why they became relevant is, of course, also efficiency. So they're not as efficient as LEDs, but they're pretty good. And they are low pressure, and they also use mercury vapor. But mercury vapor, with all the horrors of mercury vapor. So what are the problems with fluorescent bulbs? So first of all, you get a poor color spectrum. So these things, they typically had a green tint. And this feeling of green tinted kind of medical institutions with white walls, I seem to have this memory, like you can still get this kind of effect in your home if you buy these kinds of bulbs. Of course, nowadays you can buy compact fluorescents that actually are much warmer and feel more like incandescent bulbs. So the mixture, they changed the mixture, but still we are phasing all of this out because, once again, these things contain mercury. They do need recycling, but of course, if you ask people, like, do you actually go around the city? Do you find those recycling points? I'm sure most people would just say, screw it, I just put it in the garbage bin and let nature sort it out, which is a horrible way to go, to be honest. I personally do, in fact, chase out. There are these eco buses scattered throughout the city. You can find one and just give them your old batteries, your old lights, everything. But that's just me. So fluorescent lights were the last bit of tech before we moved on to our winner. And fortunately or unfortunately, the winner of this entire race of artificial light is the light-emitting diode. Now, diodes have been around for a really long time, of course, but it was only in the early 90s that this guy by the name of Nakamura invented the blue diode. And of course, his work was based on work by two other Japanese guys who worked on gallium nitrate crystals. And so we had this progression. So initially we had the red and green LEDs, but blue was the missing piece and actually a very hard problem. So that was 60s and 70s. In the 80s, these guys, Akasaki and Amano, they developed high quality GaN or gallium nitrate crystals, which allowed Nakamura to create the high brightness blue LEDs and make them commercially viable, and that sparked the whole sort of LED light revolution. Because ultimately, the modern white LED, the white LED bulb, is actually a blue diode plus a phosphor, which creates some sort of spectral distribution, which is reasonably suitable for our eyes. And of course, this came with very high energy efficiency. And you also suddenly got a choice of color temperature, so you didn't have to stick to what a specific gas emits at a specific wavelength and nothing like that. You can have warm LEDs, you can have sort of daylightish LEDs or neutral or cold LEDs. Now, the typical LED spectrum looks kind of like this. So in the background, you can see the spectral distribution of daytime light, and in the foreground, the colorful part is an LED. And there are a few problems with this, to be honest. One of those problems is the blue spike, the fact that you are using a blue diode to generate light. So for most of the light bulbs that you buy, there will be this kind of shape. So you will have a blue spike, then you have a cyan gap. So you actually have a lack of energy in the cyan colors. And then towards the end, and this is the critical problem, you have a lack of reds. And this is especially annoying for people who are used to incandescent lights, because incandescent lights give you a lot of red, which is of course great for seeing anything red colored. Here you have a distinct lack of energy in the reds. But anyways, let's talk about the LED light bulb. So the classic kind of LED light bulb is essentially a heatsink at the bottom, and then you have a circuit board with a bunch of LED chips which are facing up, and you have some sort of plastic diffuser at the top, which makes everything nice and diffuse. Unlike an incandescent bulb, it does not get so hot, although it varies because you can thermally mismanage an LED bulb, and it can be really annoying. You do get diffuse lighting. So there are fewer harsh shadows because instead of just one emitter, you have a bunch of smaller chips, but they're also shooting their light into this diffuser white piece of plastic, basically. Now, LED bulbs, by and large, are typically not dimmable. They're not compatible with the kind of phase dimming technology that we've been using for incandescent lights. There are a few exceptions to this, but by default, I think you should assume that an LED bulb is not dimmable this way. And they're definitely not dimmable in a dim to warm way. So if you dim them, the color temperature stays the same. Whereas with incandescents, if you dim them, the color temperature becomes, warmer, shall we say. There are also exceptions to this, like there's a Philips Warm Glow product which tries to mimic this kind of behavior. And I think it's a very good idea, actually, to have these kinds of bulbs. That is, if you go the LED route. So LEDs won, but why did they win? What are the advantages? Now, the first and most obvious advantage is that they have very high energy efficiency. So they are like 10 times more efficient than incandescents. And so that's the main reason. Another reason is lifetime. So an incandescent light bulb lives for 1,000 hours. This can live 30,000, maybe even 50,000. These are theoretical numbers, by the way, because like I said, a lot of cheaper LED bulbs, they are so thermally mismanaged that they basically fry themselves inside out, and they don't live nearly as long, unfortunately. LED bulbs also operate at lower temperatures, and an unfortunate side effect of this was that all the manufacturers of lamps and different kind of bulb holders, they all went with plastic instead of ceramic holders. So now we have this stupid situation where you buy like a desktop lamp, for example, it has a plastic holder, so it's enough for LED bulbs, obviously, but if you put in like an incandescent source, it can actually melt the socket itself, which is infuriating. And this causes, well, the technically qualified among us just replace all the sockets with ceramic ones because, well, it's just ridiculous. It's a stupid problem to have, to be honest. So typically the rating is that when you buy like a light bulb or like a lamp nowadays, it would be rated up to 40 watts, 40. So I have 95-watt bulbs in some places, and 40 watts is not enough for me. Variable color temperature has been pretty good for modulating, among other things, people's perception of light. So you can get warmer colors, you can get incandescent style, and you can get even warmer. You can get 2200K kind of decorative incandescent level LEDs, but you can also get daylight LEDs and neutrals and cold ones if you want to. So there's lots of variation there. So one thing I wanted to mention is that in addition to this white domed bulb, the plastic bulb, which became kind of the norm, there's also the filament LED bulb, which is also now making its way throughout the world. So that is a slightly different architecture. You basically have tiny LEDs, and those tiny LEDs are spaced along the different lines, which are made to look like filaments in a classic incandescent bulb. So it's actually made to resemble in some way incandescent bulbs. And the reason why it exists, or at least one of the reasons, is that some people actually have like crystal chandeliers and basically things made of glass. And if you put ordinary LED bulbs in them, it just looks absolutely awful. So that's why we have this kind of structure. But it's not the only reason. In actual fact, these filament LED bulbs, they are electrically simpler because you can drive them at a higher voltage and you need less electronics in the base. Their light quality at the moment compared to those white domed LED bulbs is slightly inferior, but not significantly so. These bulbs are even more not dimmable than ordinary bulbs. You're unlikely to ever find a dimmable bulb like this. In actual fact, if you just look at the structure, you can see that there's virtually no place where you would actually hide the circuitry necessary to support phase dimming. So that is quite a bit of a challenge. They also use a glass dome like incandescent lights, and as a result, you have less diffusion, so the shadows are harsher. And in addition, that actual glass dome is also the heatsink. That's the part that gets hot and radiates a small amount of heat out in all directions. It's still not as bad as incandescent, of course, but it can still be annoying. Finally, LEDs has allowed us to have the smart bulb. So that is essentially an LED bulb, which also have some sort of radio control module in its base, in addition to all the other electronics. And the control can be done in different ways. There's Wi-Fi control, and there are specialized protocols like Zigbee or Z-Wave that you can use to control this bulb. So it's kind of a retrofit solution. Instead of doing wired home automation, you make everything wireless, and the bulb just communicates either to your Wi-Fi system, or it communicates to other smart devices via some sort of mesh network. So you control this thing using either mobile apps or home automation systems. And inside this bulb, you can have one diode or you can have several diodes. Like, for example, there are bulbs which contain RGB, so they have separate red, green, and blue diodes. They might have tunable white, which is two LEDs at a different color temperature, like one of them would be cold and one of them would be warm, and then you could sort of regulate the color temperature depending on what you need, or they might just be single color. Now, these bulbs are typically heavy, but the bigger problem is that the LEDs used in these bulbs are typically just not great. And by not great, I mean they're pretty bad bulbs. I don't recommend you use them for like living spaces or anything like that. You can use them in certain specific situations, like some of them have motion control sensors, so you can stick them like in a pantry or something that you walk into, or maybe you use them for I don't know, some decorative purposes, like occasionally, but certainly not as a main source of light, not as a full-time kind of study light or work light. Absolutely not. Now, I mentioned previously that the pear or pear-like shape is not the only shape of bulb out there. There are lots of different bases, lots of different forms of bulbs, and generally you do have some variety in this particular case. But we also have something very specific called an LED fixture or a luminaire. So what is this? Well, essentially, a fixture is just a combination of some sort of bulb, and it could be a proprietary bulb that you cannot buy externally. It would have some sort of housing, so it would have maybe a plastic diffuser or a heat sink or something around it. It would have the transformer electronics, possibly some control circuitry for home automation, this sort of thing. So essentially, an LED fixture is just a kind of ready-to-use complete system. So you plug in your power, mains power, for example. You also can plug in some protocol like DALI, for example, and then off you go. And you just use it inside your ceilings, for example. So these kinds of LED fixtures, they typically use proprietary emitters, which means that you cannot just, if this breaks, you cannot just go out and buy a bulb and replace the bulb yourself. Unfortunately, you have to contact the manufacturer and ask them to provide either a new bulb or sometimes even a new assembly for this to work. But it's possible to get better transformer equipment. Now, in a typical light bulb, what happens is people try to get all the AC to DC transformer stuff and maybe dimming support and stick it into the base of the bulb. And there isn't just that much space in there to begin with. So when you have your transformers and external blocks that you stick into a ceiling somewhere, that is much easier to get right, to make it better, basically. And as a result, the transformer equipment of LED fixtures is always typically superior to ordinary bulbs. It's also possible to actually get better light quality, surprisingly enough. So bulbs are a kind of mass market product. They are sold they're made as cheaply as possible with, well, you do get some quality control, but they're made very cheaply, and they are designed to be a mass market thing, whereas a LED fixture is something that is much more expensive, but it's much more thought out, and maybe, just maybe, the manufacturer has actually put in a better quality LED inside that thing. Now, one thing that LEDs have allowed, which is very cool, is LED strips. So that's basically the idea of separate LED chips being stuck on a self-adhesive strip that you can stick somewhere. It's very useful for creating all sorts of light effects, like ceiling contour lights, backlighting furniture, any kind of decorative lighting. Like, let's say if you have an alcove of some kind and you want it lit up around the perimeter, you would use an LED strip for that. Now, LED strips, they don't have any transformer equipment by themselves, which means that you need a separate power supply for each LED strip, or for a combination of LED strips, and you also need some sort of dimmer for control, and you need to hide these things somewhere. Either you put them in your electrical panel or you put them somewhere in your ceiling, but you have to have that transformer there somewhere. Now, these LED strips, they can get quite hot because, well, it's just ordinary chips without any kind of thermal management by themselves. So typically you take this tape and you stick it onto aluminum profiles for heat dissipation. So the aluminum would dissipate the heat in all directions and prevent the whatever you're stuck to from overheating. And sometimes also these aluminum profiles have diffusers on top so that you don't see the individual LED chips. But nowadays we also have the cob variety of LED strip. That's chip on board. But basically the idea is that you have so many chips going stuck very close together that you don't even see the individual chips, because everything is kind of diffused by default. So you don't need a separate diffuser for this particular purpose. So LED strips are very useful. But LEDs, well, they ultimately won. And the reason why they won is because of efficiency, mainly reduced operating costs, and also a long rated life, which means you don't need to maintain them so frequently. Because imagine if you had to swap out an LED strip every 1,000 hours, you would have to literally like scrape it off the aluminum profiles and then attach a new strip. That would be completely crazy. So a long life makes lots of interesting things possible. They are also very small emitters, so they enable all sorts of form factors. The reason why they went into cars, for example, and like screens, like the displays that we see, is because they can be miniaturized. They don't consume that much energy. You can stick them virtually everywhere, which is sometimes a curse because people do stick them everywhere. Now, electronics, they enable dimming, or at least dimming for sources like LED strips. It's a bit more difficult for bulbs, obviously, and you have all sorts of wonderful color effects, and you can tie them in with home automation. Like, for example, you can tie in the color temperature to some sort of home automation control, so that you have your LED strips being making colder light during the day, but warmer light during the mornings and evenings. That's called human-centric lighting. So there are lots of interesting approaches there. The LEDs are not without their weak spots. So you still have heat mismanagement, especially in cheap bulbs. You do have, as a result, driver failure because the internal electronics, they fail. You do have some issues with flicker. We'll talk about flicker when we talk about health effects of light. The spectrum quality of LEDs is generally not as good. Obviously, it cannot be as good as incandescent lights. So it's kind of here and there. And repairability is something which is, well, incandescent bulbs, you just throw them away, whereas with LED bulbs, they are repairable in theory, but you need to have the skills to do so. So with all that in mind, let's talk about one of the most important things, which is how light actually affects health. What are the health implications of having artificial light as opposed to just relying on the sun for everything? So first of all, this might come as a surprise to some people, but artificial light disrupted what was normal for humans, and that is the two-sleep cycle. So prior to the introduction of artificial light, what happened is people slept in two periods. Like they would have a first sleep, then they would have a short wake period, sometimes called the watch, then they would have the second sleep. Now, this is all gone because nowadays with artificial light, what we can do is we can extend the bedtime much later. We don't have to just say, oh, the sun has set, therefore why don't we just finish our business and just light up a candle, read a little, and go to sleep? With artificial light, you can work well into the night, which is certainly what all sorts of exploitative businesses have leveraged by getting people to stay up late and overwork them, basically. So we also synchronized work schedules, so you work from 9 to 5, whether it's winter or summer, even though in winter and in summer the amount of sunlight that you have is drastically different. Winter is a separate, really interesting topic because imagine if it was winter and you had no artificial light. Like how would you survive? How would you survive without feeling sleepy all the time? Because personally, like, let me give you an example. I went to Kiruna, which is beyond the Arctic Circle in Sweden. And when I went there, it was the polar night. So 23 hours out of 24 was darkness. And I wanted to sleep all the time. So my body was basically telling me throughout this entire 23-hour period that you want to sleep, you want to go to bed. And that's why they have these lamps inside the hotel. You turn on this lamp and it shines colder light at you so that you don't feel so sleepy. And certainly LEDs help in this regard too. And it's worth mentioning blue light. Actually, that's the reason why you would prevent somebody from sleeping. So modern LEDs, they use a blue LED as the emitter, and then as a result of this, you typically have a large blue spike in the spectrum. Especially in cheap light bulbs, the spectrum looks something like this. Now, the problem with the blue LED is it suppresses melatonin, which is great if you have the polar night, but not so great if you want to get a good night's sleep and you're staring at a screen or you have these light sources in the room, because using light sources with a strong blue component can actually postpone sleep until later. And the solution to that is to use lights with a warmer color temperature, because that has a lower blue spike. Like, for example, a 2200K LED, it would have a tiny blue component, and most of the energy would be in the red component. And 2200 LEDs, they actually look kind of decent. They look really pleasant, and you don't feel that you are missing out on a good light spectrum so much, because it's red skewed. The red energy still isn't as good as incandescent, but it's pretty good, and it feels okay-ish. Now, when it comes to sleep disruption, intensity also matters. So it's not just blue components. If you have less of a blue component, if you have incandescent sources, but it's extremely bright, it will also mess up your sleep. So the approach to avoiding sleep disruption is, first of all, go for warm temperature lights. So even if you go for LEDs, try to get 2200K ones. Get some sort of, if you can, have dimmable, so the intensity isn't so high. Your computers and your screens like tablet or phone displays, they all now have a night mode where they tone down on the amount of blue light, just so that it doesn't affect you so much. Still, staring into them is generally a terrible idea. You want to take at least 1 hour before sleep where you're not staring into any screen, where you're sort of relaxing and maybe, I don't know, reading a book on an e-ink monitor rather than the active sort of light emitting one. Well, other things that affect sleep disruption are just light sources throughout the night. So ideally you want to black everything out as much as possible. You want to disable all the passive light emitters, like you have LED little standby lights on your chargers and your TV and whatever. You want to basically tape off all of this, because it's just infuriating. Another thing that I mentioned earlier and I wanted to touch upon is flicker. Now, flicker is a normal process, like, for example, for incandescent sources, because they use the ordinary mains electricity, ordinary alternating current. That current is supplied at 50 hertz. So essentially your incandescent bulb is flickering at 100 hertz, but it's generally not a problem because of thermal inertia, because as the bulb heats up, and when the actual sine wave goes through zero, the bulb hasn't had enough time to cool down. So it's sort of this thermal inertia which carries it onwards. It does become a bit more visible when dimmed, but under normal conditions, it's fine. It's not a problem. It also does become more visible if you have a bad sine wave, like if you're running off a generator. But once again, under normal conditions, incandescent bulbs, even when they're dimmed, they are perfectly fine. The brain doesn't register any flicker. There is no problem. Now, with LEDs, it's a particular pain point, or at least it was a particular pain point until recently, because flicker was possible. And depending on how good or how bad the driver is inside the LED source, you can get some flicker. And also some LED bulbs, they use really cheap electronics, which are sensitive to bad alternating current. So once again, if you have any harmonics on the line, your light bulb might flicker because of that. And sometimes the flicker might be imperceptible. You might not be able to consciously see it, but your brain would still register it. And as a result, you do get headaches and tiredness and eye strain and all those other unpleasant effects. So that is something that you want to avoid if possible. Now, here's an interesting thing. Even though LED bulbs, they do have this weak point that they are trying to cram a lot of electronics into a very small base, and as a result, they can be sensitive to flicker. Conventional LED sources, this should be LED sources, not LED bulbs, they are actually also dimmed by high frequency flicker. So all those LED tapes, like if you have an LED strip or an LED tape, if you're in the States and you want to dim it, that is also done by something called pulse width modulation, which is basically switching an LED source on and off with a very large frequency. And that is also flicker, but that is flicker which is happening at a very high frequency. So your brain doesn't have any chance to actually see it and perceive it as a problem. And as a result, it's not a health concern. It can be a health concern if your electronics are bad, or if you're doing PWM at too low a frequency, then yeah, it can become annoying. But generally for like your typical LED strips or just separate luminaires that you're controlling through a dimmer of some kind, that is not a problem. Mercury content, something I mentioned already. Mercury is toxic, and you find it in fluorescent bulbs and in high-intensity bulbs. So high pressure sodium metal halide and so on and so forth. It is considered hazardous waste. It must be recycled. If you break one of these bulbs, then it's an obvious cause for concern. You don't want to keep it in your home. You want to get rid of it as soon as possible, and preferably get rid of it safely. Another thing that especially the tinfoil hat people would talk about quite a bit is electromagnetic interference. So it's a funny story because most of the home equipment in our homes actually uses direct current, but the utility actually supplies alternating current. Alternating current is a lot easier to supply at large distances. Of course, that's why currently, even though high voltage DC lines do exist, we still use AC for most of what we do. And as a result, AC-DC electronics, they're everywhere, not just inside light bulbs, but also inside USB chargers and inside most of the equipment, like most of the kitchen equipment, like everything inside your home is AC to DC. And this generates electromagnetic noise, which you can see, for example, as radio interference. So if you take a radio, and I know many people out there don't even own a radio, but if you do have a radio receiver, just switch to medium wave frequencies and try walking around your home and walking up to like USB chargers and stuff, and you would just hear lots of noise through the speaker because of the radio interference. Now, we generally assume electromagnetic interference to be safe because as I sit here, lots of waves are going through me. It's Wi-Fi, it's Bluetooth, it's all sorts of radio frequencies, and cosmic radiation, blah, blah, blah. Everything is going through everybody, and we generally assume it to be safe. However, personally, I would prefer, of course, if there was no EM interference, especially close to me as I sleep. Like, for example, right next to my bed, I have some electric sockets, but also some of them have USB ports, and those USB ports are always on. They are never unpowered. They never kind of go to sleep. So they produce radio interference all the time, and I would prefer if it wasn't there. But once again, there is no evidence that this is doing anything unpleasant to human beings or affecting the kind of affecting people in any significant way. Obviously, radiation, like let's say the Chernobyl accident, for example, that does affect people. But general EM interference in sort of household quantities, shall we say, we generally assume it to be safe. It's also worth mentioning that some social groups are particularly sensitive to light quality, and this is a particular pain point worth discussing. So probably the most vulnerable group of people is those whose visual systems are still developing. So that is students and young people. And we know that if they have poor light, then it causes eye strain, and they don't read so well. Their attention is reduced. Their learning outcomes are a lot lower, and this is like we can have a separate discussion about this, because one argument you could have is, oh, look, schools have been using fluorescent lights for decades, and it's been well, nobody has died, shall we say. So let's just assume that everything is okay. However, my personal view on this matter is that with LEDs, it's a lot easier to mismanage things, because cheap LEDs are really bad. And if you put cheap LED emitters in a school, for example, you are doing a terrible disservice. And the funny thing is, you put a bad LED source in a school, I guarantee not a single parent will come to the school with like a Spectrum analyzing device to actually like point out that these LEDs, like, they flicker or that they are low CRI. Generally, nobody cares. And it's also worth remembering that municipal contracts are typically won by the lowest bidder, and the lowest bidder is likely to install the cheapest light system they absolutely can. They would just throw in these square LED panels that I'm sure many of you have seen. So this approach is, personally, I find this unacceptable. Personally, I think that, as children are developing, you want the best and highest quality of light sources that you can get. And it just turns out that at least in the home, at least in my home, the best light sources would be incandescent lights. And I would try to get the kids to get used to those and to study under incandescent light and to play under incandescent light mainly. There are some LEDs that are used for augmentation, but even then, you really want to control the quality and like the CRI and the flicker of those lights. Like have an actual device that can tell you the spectral distribution and the flicker and the color temperature so that you can see whether or not it's okay. Because LEDs are not universally evil, even though there are operating theories, like one theory which hasn't been proven, just wanted to mention, but one theory is that the reason why there was a huge jump in myopia cases in Japan and South Korea is because in younger people is because they went from incandescent to LEDs. Although nowadays the prevailing theory is that the reason why their eyesight went so bad, and this is actually documented. So the fact that the increase in myopia cases has skyrocketed in those countries is not under dispute. What is under the dispute is the cause. So some people argue that it's because they switched to LEDs. Other people argue that it's because the cultural shift towards overworking and overstudying of young people, which is also really it's true. So there's some discussion to be had here, but I would want to remove all the potential extra variables by providing the best quality of light that you can. And I think that especially for commercial educational institutions who charge people money, the electricity costs on incandescent or let's say halogen lights are negligible compared to like a student. If a student pays in like $1,000 a month for school, then the electricity costs are not going to be significant compared to that. And certainly in the home, my approach is to, especially with kids, use incandescent sources everywhere. Elderly people have aging eyes. They need more light, better contrast. They're also more sensitive to glare. Now, glare is another thing that we haven't really discussed. So glare is essentially parasitic reflections. So a light that's being reflected off other surfaces in annoying ways. Now, one way you would find glare is, for example, you have a downlight and the actual side walls of the downlight are reflective. And so not only is the downlight shining down at you like at a table or something, but it's also reflecting off those sides. And I've seen it in at least one 5-star hotel, which is why I'm annoyed about it. Because obviously nowadays downlights are made so that the glare is zero. We paint them black and we also put in those little anti-reflective nets right on top of the light emitter to prevent glare in any way, shape or form. But a lot of people ignore these kinds of things. They don't know that there are these little net kind of things that you can, like filters that you can install to prevent glare. So something worth keeping in mind. Now, shift workers, that is a particularly vulnerable category. People who work at night, who work during the times when your body knows that there's a lack of light, therefore you need to sleep. Now, that is where the use of blue light actually makes sense, because you want people to be awake as opposed to sort of drifting off to sleep. But you have to be very careful with those, because otherwise you can introduce sleep disorders in people. So that is a separate area of kind of people management, I guess, health management, that is, once again, on the one hand, LEDs are useful for this. On the other hand, you have to be really careful not to mess with people's circadian rhythms too much, because then their body just loses all orientation, all understanding of when to sleep and when not to sleep. People with visual impairments obviously need higher quality light sources, better CRI, more contrast, minimum glare, and also people with neurological sensitivities. This is actually a more pronounced issue. So people who suffer from migraines, for example. One thing I hear quite a bit is that for people with migraines, they just go with incandescent lights because it's less flicker and it's a fuller spectrum. So that makes sense. But also there's lots of issues that people face where the quality of the light matters. So let me try to summarize what we've talked about, because we've been talking through a very long time. So what have we learned? Well, the evolution of light, one way or another, went towards the road of LEDs in all directions. So in the home, you had incandescent, and then we went to fluorescent, then we went to LED. In the street or in the industry, we had gas lights and all sorts of high pressure or high intensity devices, and then everything also went to LEDs. In cars, we had halogen. We also had some high intensity sources like xenon. By the way, xenon is a particularly awful light source. It's awful that it's illegal to retrofit this, and there are really punitive measures if you retrofit xenon lights into cars, because xenon works really poorly if your headlights are dirty. If they're dirty, then xenon just scatters in all directions and blinds everyone, and it just becomes an insane kind of situation. So everything went to LEDs as well, and all the other areas, like if you want to do photography or cinema, or if you want to light up offices, literally everything went to LEDs, for better or for worse. This is just the status quo. This is what we are left with. Now, personally, my approach is to focus on light quality. So in terms of general like living spaces or workspaces, there is no argument that incandescent still gives you the best quality, the best CRI, the best kind of color distribution, the best color rendering that you can get out there. So if you are happy with incandescence, if you're happy with the energy costs and whatever, then I recommend you still use those if you can. Try to get incandescent bulbs and find good diffusers, good shades, whatever, and please use dimming. Dimming is very important. It makes everything even nicer, because towards the evening, when you're not in so much of a working mood, but you want to just relax and just sit around, listen to music, you just dim it down. The light becomes more red. It becomes even more relaxing. It is just great. Now, if you are using LEDs, try not to go for some no-name like $1 bulb that you found in the corner of some unknown supermarket. Try to go for known brands, even though it will be more expensive. And go for a 90 plus CRI. Personally, I would go for like 97 and so on, the really advanced stuff. But it's difficult to find, and often the very high CRI bulbs are very expensive, because it's a niche product. It's not a general product that everybody just gets. Now, bedrooms are a separate story, because that's the place where you are typically sort of falling to sleep, so to speak. So decorative incandescent sources are absolutely wonderful in this particular area. Or just use ordinary incandescents with dimming to get the colors to sort of red amber-ish colors. If you go with LEDs, 2200K is great, but the highest I would go is 2700K. Dimming does help. Dimming does help with intensity. Remember, I said that sleep disruption happens not just because of the blue component, but also because of the intensity. So if I take a very warm light, but I make it really intense and shine it into your eyes, it can also disrupt your sleep. So that's why dimming makes sense even for LEDs, even without any kind of dim to warm features. Unfortunately, nowadays, dim to warm features are not so available in light bulbs. They're more available in light fixtures, which is why if you go for a light fixture, maybe think about installing a dim to warm one if you can, especially in home automation setups. That's where it just becomes a new level of comfort. Now, there are places where you don't care about the light quality. And those are typically like service or utility spaces, potentially the outdoors, unless you spend a lot of time outdoors. Like if you're on a construction site outdoors during darkness, during winter, then yeah, it's a different story. But generally, these are not so sensitive to quality. Notice I also include rentals here. That is a particularly hostile thing for me to do. Like, don't you care about the eyes of people who rent from you? Well, rentals are still going to install the most energy efficient lights by definition, and as a result, they're not going to be so great. And there's nothing that we can do to really fight this. So this is the place where you can install LEDs with maximum efficiency, like those 200 lumen per watt ones, without caring about overall CRI or anything like that. If you want, you can try, and they're still available, you can try high intensity sources like high pressure sodium for some outdoor lighting. If you're using, if you need a security light, then why not? I mean, yeah, you're getting a different picture to what an LED would give you, but that's okay. High pressure sodium it can look just fine, and some people like in the city, some people still use it for kind of night or evening lamp lights. So that is just, as a fun project, I have a high pressure sodium light outside my house, and it looks pretty good. Nice and orange and very cozy, even though I'm aware that like the green grass doesn't look green anymore. That's fine by me because, well, it's used at night mainly. Now, I wanted to briefly mention some of the advanced topics, some of the things that if you wanted to explore this whole idea and somehow maximize the quality for yourself, for your family, then there are a couple of avenues to explore, and I hope that I can touch on them in some of the other videos. So one of them is combining the spectra of different light sources. So you can get bulb splitters, like a splitter which is Y-shaped, or in actual fact, you can get splitters which have more than two bulbs, and you can stick different bulbs into those holes. So for example, what I do is I have a dimmable LED bulb, not a high quality one, by the way, and I also have a halogen bulb in a splitter. And it's a really interesting effect. I will do another video on it, but essentially at low levels, at low intensities, the LED doesn't come on, and it's just the incandescent red kind of sunset-ish light. But as you kind of light it up, both of them come on. So the LED provides the energy efficiency, and the incandescent source provides that red component. Now, it's not an ideal setup. It's not an ideal combination by any measure, but it's still better than what you get out of the box. But this is more of an advanced kind of approach that I'm sure most people would not entertain for a variety of reasons. Another thing worth mentioning is that not all LED chips use a blue LED as the original emitter. You do have violet pump LEDs. They are rare, but they give you much better CRI, and they're generally just better across the board, not just the sort of the first 8 components of the CRI, but actually, there are other scales out there, and violet pump LEDs are much better when used in those more kind of modern scales that I didn't talk about. Unfortunately, these products are all niche products. It's very difficult to find bulbs which use those LEDs. Lots of people build light bulbs and build light fixtures based on those, but it's very hard to just buy something off the shelf, or if you do find it, it's going to be expensive. It will come at a premium. Finally, worth mentioning low voltage incandescents. Like I said, there is a separate layer of reality related to 12 volt halogen. There's a separate, you could do a separate talk on why they exist and the different varieties and whatever. So they're typically not like E14 or E27. There are different shapes of emitters, but it's still like a very interesting subset of our existence, so to speak. But in addition, you also have low voltage incandescent bulbs. And funnily enough, those bulbs, they take both alternating current and direct current. And that is why you can dim them using pulse width modulation, the way that LEDs are typically dimmed. And you can also mess around with series connections. So the idea of series connections is if you put several low voltage lights in series, it ups the voltage that is being consumed. That is how string lights work, like, decorative lights you would hang outside your home, same principle. So that is also another very interesting kind of approach. And of course, beyond that, you have the approach with just custom electronics and building your own specific light fixtures. So you can, instead of buying a desktop lamp, you can buy a desktop lamp body, and then you can use the base of that body to build a combination of circuits which do all sorts of wonderful things. And once again, I'll have to talk about it at some point, but that is certainly not mainstream and certainly not something that people would be doing by themselves, at least most people. So a few additional materials for you to study if you want to. So remember, I mentioned that whole two-sleep cycle and how we destroy that using artificial light. There is a video, or at least one video on that. In addition, there's a Veritasium video on the light bulb conspiracy, but then there is also a Technology Connections video on why it wasn't, well, it was a conspiracy, but on the other hand, maybe it was a good choice of overall energy efficiency. And Technology Connections has actually lots of videos on different light bulb and related technologies. If you're interested in like how all sorts of these gas lamps work and whatever, I highly recommend the entire channel. It's just really fascinating. And finally, I recommend the Big Clive channel, which has all sorts of tech videos, including like light bulbs being disassembled and showing pictures of the internal circuitry. That's very interesting for figuring out whether or not certain like LED light bulbs are actually any good or not. So that is it. That is my overview of the various lighting technologies. So thank you very much for watching, and see you again.